I think by now, most people agree that aim trainers do help you in real games. There are so many testimonies of improvement because of the focused practice they promote, and there are countless pros across basically every big esport at the moment who use them actively. But there is another question I've seen fairly often over the years which doesn't have that same unified consensus, which is when do aim trainers stop being useful? At what skill level is improving in aim trainers all about getting better at aim trainers instead of getting better at aiming in FPS games? And it's kind of intuitive, right? There are a lot of mechanics within FPS games that you can't train within an aim trainer, so it makes sense that there would be a point where your raw aim is good enough for whatever game you're training for, and that your time would be better spent playing the game than in an aim trainer. This idea is further supported by aim trainers pushing aim so much further than it usually is within games with faster and smaller targets. But is that actually the case? Is there actually a point where your raw mechanics can be so good that any improvement on top of that is only visible in aim trainers, and if there is, where is that point? The first time I saw this question was when I was initially getting into aim training. This was maybe 4 years ago now. The community was a lot smaller at the time, and because of that there wasn't really anywhere to go for information about aim training other than a few Discord servers. I remember the answer given was something along the lines of, "It's very useful when you're new, but trails off as you get better. I honestly can't tell a master rank player apart from the best aim trainer players in actual games." At the time I was 20 hours in and had just hit platinum on the Voltaic benchmarks, and I was improving my scores every day with my in-game performance following suit. I was honestly a little shocked just how much it helped me. I had already ironed out so many issues with my mechanics and I didn't see how that improvement could just stop. That being said though, I was only 2 ranks away from Master, which was scarily close to their proposed limit of how far it's worth climbing on these benchmarks. This was in the back of my mind as I kept playing, but the benefits I felt in game didn't stop when I did get Master. After 80 hours, it still felt like I was getting better each day, and watching old clips made it very easy to see my improvement. This was also around the time I began to really enjoy aim training. It was satisfying to see my scores go up overall, but I especially liked speed-focused scenarios. By 400 hours, I was still Master overall, but had pushed my speed target switching to the very top rank. I began to put more time into aim training than I did actual games, and when I did play FPSs, I didn't do much better than I did 300 hours of training earlier. Sure, my flicks felt faster from all the speed practice, but I lost a lot more gunfights than I did even before aim training at all, which honestly really affected my confidence. After all this time practicing, I still couldn't win my duels. I remember thinking back to that comment about how Master was the cutoff point and realizing that it did mostly align with my experience. My progress slowed down around Master too. The reason why I started all of this was to get better at FPS games, and if aim training wasn't going to help me anymore, why bother? Because of that, I mostly stopped playing aim trainers and went back to putting all of my time into FPS games, and I started seeing improvement in them again. I hit new peaks in CSGO, my flicks felt sharp in Battlefield, and my confidence slowly started coming back. I felt like that original comment was right, and that aim training had no value in games after around Masters. But if that was the case, what would be the reason? My guess was that no game I played stressed raw mechanics enough for it to make a difference. CSGO focused more on crosshair placement and micro adjustments than wide flicks, and the same was true for Valorant, but my flicks were already good enough for Battlefield and COD. Even in a game like Apex with a longer time to kill, my tracking improved more from just playing the game than it did from aim training. I had already gotten my underlying mechanics to a high enough level, with every skill being at least Masters, and any extra time spent aim training would be wasted, just like the last 300 hours were. I did play a bit more after this, but it was exclusively for fun, not with the goal of improving in games. I'm sure some of you can see the flaw in my logic already, but it took until mid-2022 when I finally came back to aim training for me to spot it. I started playing again to compete with a friend and one of his friends. He challenged me to beat their scores in a few different tracking scenarios. This was one of my weakest skills, mainly since I barely played it when aim training prior. It was a bit of a grind with some back and forth between us, but I did eventually match and even surpass them both, bringing my tracking up to the same rank as my old target switching scores. And to my surprise, when trying out Apex again after all this, I felt a massive improvement in my ability to read and track enemies' movements. I was so much more consistent. Throughout that entire competition, I was just doing it, well, to compete. I had a fun time trying to beat my friends' scores and pushing myself further, but I honestly didn't think it would help since my tracking was already pretty good in aim trainers. Ever since I first heard the idea of the limit to aim training's helpfulness, I'd seen that idea mirrored by so many people, placing that limit around the Jade or Master ranks. That was meant to be the point where any progress further was just getting better at aim trainers, learning the scenario and whatnot, but if that was true, then why did I improve so much going from Grandmaster to Astra? Watching back my old clips, my flicks actually did improve a lot after playing aim trainers, but it was the other parts of my aim that made it feel like they hadn't. So now I've trained both reactive tracking and speed target switching up to an Astra level and felt benefits in game from both, so where does that put our limit of aim training's usefulness? The intuitive answer is Astra, but does my experience really prove it? What if it was just placebo? What if it was just those two categories that transfer over well? What if getting into the top 10 helped further still? I don't feel like I'd do the topic justice without putting these questions to the test myself. One of my longest goals in aim training has been being in the top 10 worldwide on the Season 3 Voltaic benchmarks. This is my score sheet currently, placing me at number 54 on the leaderboard. To get into the top 10, I would have to push every scenario to Astra as well as pushing around half to Celestial. I don't even know if it's possible for me. It's a very far out there goal, but I think it's needed if I want to properly answer this question. So after reaching top 10 worldwide as well as pushing all of my scores past my old peaks, I can say that honestly, it helped me way more than I thought it would. It felt like most of the scenarios had their benefits in game, and while there were a few scenarios that didn't help much, these were the exceptions. This improvement is even more crazy to me considering I was doing something I don't normally do and that you're not meant to do for in-game improvement. Even though I did play other scenarios to practice, most of my time was spent grinding the benchmarks. This does raise the question though, if getting into the top 10 helped me so much, why did I struggle to win my duels even after reaching a high rank in aim trainers in the past? I think what it came down to was that while I had pushed the ceiling of my mechanics higher through all the speed practice, because I was going for those faster flicks, I lost some of the consistency I had before when flicking slower. When I stopped aim training, I stopped trying to flick as fast, and because of that, I got some of my consistency back. After playing them again recently though, I have the consistency to go for those quick flicks, and if I do miss, I can fall back on my strong micro adjustments which I just didn't have developed before. I think consistency really is at the center of all of this. It's the main thing aim trainers help with for me, and also rebuts another one of the explanations I had for why aim trainers didn't work in the past. While games don't push aim as far as aim trainers do in individual situations, that doesn't matter since what you're searching for is consistency, which can almost always be improved. Even if you can aim at a target way smaller or more evasive than anything seen in any FPS game, could you do it every time? Because in games you have to. You can't reset the run or load up a different scenario. When you are placed in a situation that calls for good mechanics, you have to aim well in it every time or lose. This is why I think aim training will always have its uses at any skill level. While it's exceptionally useful for new players, even very experienced players will benefit from building that consistency, which is easier in aim trainers due to its long scenario times. On top of that, they help you stay consistent by removing the downtime between aiming that's present in most games, especially compared to a battle royale like Apex. Another big mistake I made was in my scenario selection. When I was aim training a lot, I was putting almost all of my time into target switching and barely any into my other skills. This was honestly really visible watching my gameplay. My flicks were sharp, but my micro adjustments were really inaccurate. In games like Counter-Strike though, those micro adjustments are what really matters. Most of the time you'll be correcting to someone near the angle you're pre-aiming, so the total amount of mouse movement is very minimal. The same thing applies for Apex. I should have been focusing on my smoothness instead of trying to work on my adjustment speed. That game has relatively slower acceleration, so being able to snap back onto a target instantly when tracking isn't as useful as maximizing your damage on strafes. I think this is something a lot of people get wrong when trying aim trainers. While lower rank players can play all aiming categories equally and see improvement in game, if you're already above, say, Diamond on the Voltaic benchmarks, the general mouse control gains will stop being as visible from day to day and you'll benefit from specializing a little. Watch some gameplay and see what kind of movements you're making when aiming, and choose scenarios in aim trainers that contain similar movements to isolate them. It doesn't have to be one-to-one. As long as it's hitting the same general skill set, it'll be so much more effective than exclusively focusing on fundamentals. That doesn't mean the other categories are useless. It's important to bring your fundamentals up to a strong level to provide a solid base to build upon when trying to lean into niches. It loops back around to consistency in a way. Just as you need to in games, building fundamentals is all about making sure you can do the simple movements perfectly, every time. Aiming really is a lot more in-depth than most people think. Even at a very high level, there is still so much to isolate and improve upon, and the results of that training do shine through into FPS games. It's a skill with basically no ceiling, and while it isn't the only deciding factor in most games, there are a lot of duels that basically just come down to who can click on the target better. That doesn't mean you can just neglect playing FPS games if you want to have good aim within them though. The way I see it, aim training builds your raw aim or mouse control, which is an underlying skill that supports game-specific skills. The better your raw aim is, the easier it is to develop these skills, but they still have to be developed independently. This is another thing that I did wrong before. I played more aim trainers than FPSs and thought that since my raw aim was good, it would just carry over without any effort. But without learning the game itself, I couldn't fully leverage my aim to excel within it. Looking at the finals as an example, when trying to pick it up recently, I focused on learning the recoil patterns, finding out about techniques like recoil smoothing, getting familiar with how fast different characters accelerate, and adapting to aiming at bounce pads, grapples, or dashes. I could isolate all of that from my raw aim since I didn't have to think about my underlying mechanics at all, which, along with spending far more time playing the game than I did aim training, led to me picking it up rather quickly. At the end of the day, aim training should always be supplementary to playing the game. Now that I've reached my goal in the benchmarks, I spend about 15 minutes warming up before I play and 30 to 40 minutes focusing on issues I notice during the play session afterwards, and only benchmark myself for about an hour once a week. This is what I think works best for me and gives me the most value for my time, but that will probably be different for you. Different games place different levels of emphasis on game-specific mechanics versus raw aim, and it's best to decide how to balance your time based on that. Generally though, I wouldn't recommend spending more than 20% of your playtime on an aim trainer. To end this off, I just want to say that even if this hadn't have helped in-game, I wouldn't regret the time I spent. Setting myself a goal like this and slowly working towards it was so rewarding, and the payoff of actually achieving it was more than worth the hours I put in. I learned a bit about what methods work best for me when striving for something like this as well, from how to discipline myself into doing somewhat tedious tasks, to breaking the task into smaller chunks and hyper-focusing on each, which honestly will help me in other areas of my life too. It's already helped me when making this video. This project has been very fulfilling for me, and it's reminded me of the power that setting clear goals and chipping away at them can have, both in and outside of FPS games.